Welcome to biology. This is Mr. Troll. Today's lesson is going to focus on the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction. Remember, from anaerobic respiration and other terms that you've seen, whenever we have a prefix of a or an, that means without. So when we talk about asexual reproduction that we've been learning about, that means without sex. So it doesn't take a partner, it doesn't take a mate. It can be done by an individual organism all by themselves. Just like with everything, there are pros and cons to any process. And so asexual reproduction is no different. It has pros and it also has cons. The cells divide by mitosis, and that's the process that we have looked at, where you have prophase and metaphase and anaphase and telophase. And one of the downsides of that is it creates genetically identical offspring. Sometimes that's good, but in other times that may not be so good. So if there is an environmental shift that kills an organism that is solely going through reproduction by asexual processes, then chances are that environmental condition would kill all of those organisms. So being genetically identical and not having any diversity can sometimes be a con and is sometimes not a benefit. One of the pros is that it does help a population grow quickly. So exponential growth occurs with asexual processes, and that is where one cell divides to make two, and two divide to make four, and you very quickly get that exponential growth, which coincides with that J-shaped curve that you guys saw in our ecology unit. Examples of asexual reproduction. In addition to learning about the cell cycle and mitosis, there are some other types of asexual reproductive processes that you guys have to be familiar with. One of those is how bacteria divide to make more bacterial cells. Asexual reproduction is the only form of reproduction in bacterial cells. They don't have a mama bacterium and a papa bacterium that make a baby bacterium. So asexual processes are the only way in which bacterial cells can divide. Remember, bacterial cells are prokaryotic, so they don't have a nucleus. The other thing that I want you to remember about bacterial cells or prokaryotes compared to eukaryotes is that bacterial cells have a single circular chromosome. Eukaryotic cells, like the ones we learned about in mitosis, have linear pairs of chromosomes. So these bacterial cells going through asexual processes only have one circular chromosome that they need to replicate before they divide. This process is called binary fission. So if it helps you to think of this, and I'll give you an alphabet analogy, think of that B as bacteria. So bacteria undergo binary fission, which is their asexual process to make more bacterial cells. Down here, that curve, as we were mentioning, asexual reproduction allows a population to grow really rapidly, and that results in exponential growth, or what we refer to as that J-shaped curve that you learned about in ecology, which is also how our human population is currently growing. This process of binary fission, because bacteria are prokaryotic, is much more simplistic than mitosis is, as with most things compared with prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. The eukaryotic cells have a more complex process. Here are some other examples of asexual processes. In addition to binary fission, there is this process known as budding. And budding occurs in these organisms called yeast that you learned about in anaerobic respiration. So yeast was the unicellular fungus that was going through alcoholic fermentation. And then there's this other organism that you're not familiar with called a hydra, but they both have adapted to this asexual type of reproduction known as budding. So in budding, what happens is that you have an outgrowth of the parent organism, and it actually pinches off and breaks off from the parent organism, and through asexual process becomes an adult all on its own. So switching gears a little bit here, sexual reproduction. So this is where mating is required, and you have egg and sperm. Those are also required. So these are two types of specialized cells that you are responsible for. So some of the other specialized cells that we have learned about were neurons or nerve cells, skin cells, blood cells. Those are cells not related to reproductive processes, but egg and sperm are specialized cells that are related to sexual reproduction. One of the first things that we can mention is they divide by meiosis. So this is a process that looks similar to mitosis, but the end product is completely different. One of the most important things meiosis does is it creates genetic variation, and it creates a lot of it. So this is a huge deal. This allows diversity and variation to be within a population, so that if those environmental shifts happen that end up killing some of the members hope of a population, hopefully there will be enough genetic variation within that population so that that population can survive. And another trick that I'll show you to help you remember this is me. So me. Think of you. You were created by the process of meiosis. You were created by sexual reproduction. So think of it in those regards. It does result in diversity. The way that it results in genetic diversity are these two things right here. And we're not going to go into detail at this time about what these are, but what we are doing is introducing these terms. So when you see the terms independent assortment, you see the term crossing over, you need to think about meiosis, you need to think sexual reproduction, and most importantly, you need to associate those terms with genetic variation. Where asexual processes occur really fast and the population can grow at an exponential rate, sexual processes are much slower. They require male and female gametes. We'll learn what that term means shortly. And it's slower than asexual reproduction. So those male and female gametes have to come together and fuse through the process of sexual reproduction. And that takes some time. And one of the reasons it takes time, if we look at humans, for example, is it takes several years for a human to reach maturity so that they can even produce these gametes so that they can engage in sexual reproduction. So it's a much slower process. It slows things down significantly when a mate is required in order to reproduce. Again, I can't stress this enough. Sexual reproduction results in an extraordinary amount of genetic variation. And so if we're looking at rabbits, for example, and it may be kind of hard to see this guy because he blends in with his environment due to camouflage coloration, but there is a lot of variation. Some rabbits are white, some are gray, some are black, some are brown. In this environment, the rabbit that's brown is camouflaged. And so if we have these variants and we're living in an environment where there's a predator-prey interaction that we learned about in ecology, so for example, there's a lynx or another predator that hunts rabbits, then the brown rabbit is probably going to have a better chance of surviving because he is going to be camouflaged. And so what happens is the white rabbits are easily seen. More of them get eaten. The brown rabbits that blend in with the background are not as easily seen, and they can escape detection from predators. So the brown rabbit in this scenario would be able to survive better. It would be able to reproduce more and pass on that trait, which would be fur color in this case to the next generation. So we might see a shift in this population from more white rabbits to fewer white rabbits to more of the brown rabbits.